for their contribution in terms of broadening what we hope was a general interest.
The room had been prepared for a difficult conversation, but nobody expected it to end like this. King Charles entered carrying a decision that could not be softened, delayed, or negotiated away. Minutes later, Camilla was struggling to remain standing as the man who had defended her for decades declared that every remaining privilege attached to her private royal position was being withdrawn. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Evidence had surfaced, and Charles had already seen it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles did not begin with accusations. He placed a written order before Camilla and explained that, within this fictional scenario, her remaining discretionary palace access, influence over selected household matters, ceremonial privileges, and authority over certain royal arrangements were being withdrawn. Discretionary palace access meant the informal permissions granted through royal authority rather than rights guaranteed by title alone. That distinction mattered because the king was not simply reducing appearances. He was dismantling the private influence his wife had accumulated inside the institution they had navigated together for years. Camilla initially assumed the restrictions were temporary. She asked how long the changes would remain in place and whether they would be reviewed after the immediate crisis passed. Charles said nothing at first. Then the monarch set his pen beside the order and told her quietly, "There will be no review. This is permanent." The words struck harder because he had spent decades defending their partnership against criticism. What now stood between them was not protocol, it was broken trust. Camilla rose abruptly and demanded to know whether Charles truly intended to erase everything they had built together. Her voice faltered before the question was finished. The queen consort became physically overwhelmed, and for one instinctive moment, the king moved toward her. Then he stopped. The husband wanted to reach out. The monarch knew reaching out could weaken the decision he had already made. Charles finally referred to the confidential evidence file. He refused to reveal every detail immediately, saying only that it concerned actions taken without his knowledge, and that several dates matched decisions he had personally questioned at the time. A confidential evidence file, in this dramatized narrative, was a restricted collection of internal records, assembled for private royal review. Camilla listened closely until one date was mentioned. William had already been informed. The prince knew that selected household responsibilities would transfer away from Camilla, proving that Charles had prepared the consequences before confronting his wife. This was not anger spoken in the heat of the moment. The decision had been built carefully, step by step. Camilla looked again at the first page. She recognized the date immediately. Her silence told Charles something the evidence had not yet confirmed. Whatever incident had returned from the past, she already knew exactly where the story began. Charles may have delivered the judgment, but to understand why the decision cut so deeply, the people standing on either side of it must first be understood. Long before the file appeared, three people were already carrying three very different versions of loyalty. Charles believed loyalty meant protecting the person beside him. Camilla believed survival inside the monarchy depended on securing a place that could never again be questioned. William saw loyalty differently. For him, the crown belonged not to personal relationships, but to continuity, restraint, and responsibility. When those definitions collided, somebody was always going to lose. Charles had spent years defending Camilla against criticism, which made his sudden withdrawal of support feel almost impossible to her. The king had repeatedly chosen protection when public pressure grew intense, but sovereignty carried a different burden. As monarch, he was responsible not only for the people he loved, but for the institution that would survive them. William carried part of that future responsibility as heir, meaning the person expected eventually to inherit the crown and protect its long-term stability. He did not want a personal war with the queen consort. He wanted certainty. Camilla sat alone after the confrontation and replayed the same moment again and again. The loss of ceremonial privileges hurt, but something else cut deeper. Charles had prepared the decision without her. He had spoken to aides. He had informed William. He had written the order before she entered the room. For a woman who had spent years believing their survival depended on facing pressure together, that preparation felt like proof that the partnership had already fractured before she knew there was a crisis. Charles remained behind after she left. The king turned the evidence file face down and stared at the table rather than calling the waiting aide. His authority had produced the result he believed necessary, yet the cost was immediate. He had not defeated an opponent. He had wounded his wife. William understood why his father was struggling, but the prince also remembered an earlier warning Charles had dismissed. Months before, he had questioned an unexplained household decision involving access to restricted family material. Restricted family material meant private records, correspondence, or possessions controlled through limited household permissions rather than ordinary palace access. At the time, there had been no direct proof linking Camilla to the decision, and the monarch had refused to act on suspicion alone. The new evidence changed that. According to the confidential file, several incidents that once looked separate now appeared connected. Dates matched. Authorizations overlapped. Decisions Charles had questioned privately seemed to form a pattern rather than a series of harmless misunderstandings. William realized the confrontation had not been caused by one mistake. It had been built slowly, piece by piece. One entry stood out above the rest. It traced everything back to a private Windsor gathering months earlier, where a request so ordinary that nobody expected trouble had quietly started the chain reaction. The collapse did not begin with the evidence file. It began months earlier, with one request that should have been forgotten by morning. Every royal crisis has a moment that looks harmless, until history gives it another meaning. In this story, that moment came during a private Windsor gathering months before Charles confronted Camilla. Nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. No announcement had been planned. Yet one request, one refusal, and one conversation behind a closed door would later become the thread investigators pulled, until everything surrounding the Queen began to unravel. William had asked for access to archived correspondence, connected to future household responsibilities, and expected the request to be routine. Palace archive access, meaning permission to consult restricted institutional and family records, rather than ownership of them, was normally controlled through established authorization. The prince was therefore surprised when he was told the permission had recently changed. What troubled him was not simply the refusal, it was the fact that nobody had discussed the change with him beforehand. William approached Camilla privately and asked whether she knew what had happened. The queen consort reacted more sharply than he expected. She told him that not every internal household decision required the heir's approval, and questioned why he was treating an administrative matter like a constitutional crisis. The prince did not accuse her of wrongdoing, but her defensiveness stayed with him. The answer had been possible. The emotion behind it was harder to dismiss. Charles tried to end the dispute before it spread. The king told William that household procedure could not become another source of family conflict, and asked him to let the matter go unless stronger evidence emerged. The future king agreed outwardly because he understood his father's fear of another fracture. Yet privately, he believed the concern had been minimized precisely because Camilla stood at the center of it. Weeks passed before the issue returned. An administrative review uncovered several unusual requests made around the same period. Scheduling permissions had shifted. Access to correspondence had been altered. Private household records had been requested through channels that did not immediately match the normal pattern. Individually, each decision could have been explained. Together, they began to look like something else. Then came the document that changed everything. According to the recorded internal review in this fictional narrative, officials discovered a dated instruction carrying authorization that appeared inconsistent with the version Charles remembered approving. The wording was similar. The effect was not. One version granted narrower access. The other expanded it. William brought both copies directly to his father. Charles resisted the implication at first. The king insisted there had to be an administrative explanation. The prince did not argue. He simply placed the two instructions beside each other and asked him to look at the dates. Charles did. For several seconds, he said nothing. What began as quiet suspicion was about to become something far more dangerous. A confrontation in which Charles could no longer protect everyone. There were no advisors between them now, no courtiers, no carefully prepared explanation capable of absorbing the impact. Charles closed the door and placed two conflicting records on the table between himself and Camilla. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he asked the question he had spent days avoiding. Had she authorized decisions in his name that he had never knowingly approved? Her answer would determine whether this remained a marriage crisis or became a crisis of the crown. Charles had arranged the meeting only after reviewing the records himself. The king refused to confront his wife on the strength of second-hand summaries because the disputed documents concerned household authority, meaning the internal permissions used to manage access, schedules, records, and royal arrangements, rather than constitutional power. Their importance came from something more personal. Decisions appeared to have been made as though he had approved them when his own memory told him otherwise. Camilla did not deny that she had intervened. The queen consort told him the household had become increasingly disordered, and that delays were creating problems nobody seemed willing to solve. She believed the decisions were necessary, and insisted he would have understood eventually. Charles answered immediately. Understanding something afterward, he said, was not the same as authorizing it beforehand. The distinction struck directly at the trust between them. Camilla's restraint finally broke. She accused Charles of allowing William's suspicions to outweigh decades of loyalty. The king visibly recoiled at the accusation. He told her this confrontation had not been created by his son. The evidence had created it. William may have asked questions first, but the monarch had personally examined the records, compared the dates, and found discrepancies he could no longer dismiss. Camilla then made the admission that changed the entire argument. She acknowledged knowing about at least one altered instruction. She insisted, however, that its purpose had been misunderstood. According to her account during the private confrontation, the change had been intended to prevent administrative paralysis, not to seize influence or deceive the king. Charles listened, but the move from complete denial to disputed motive only deepened his concern. Charles then revealed there was more. A second group of records suggested that after the original authorization was altered, steps were taken to restrict who could examine the trail behind it. That meant the crisis was no longer only about one decision. It was also about whether someone had tried to prevent the decision from being properly reviewed. Camilla went still. Then she asked the question she had been avoiding. Who controlled those records now? Charles did not soften the answer. William had been asked to oversee the immediate review. The argument had exposed the wound, but the next decision would reveal who now possessed the power to reshape the royal household around it. Anger could explain a confrontation. It could not explain what came next. Charles did not simply demand an apology or temporarily reduce Camilla's role. He began dismantling the discretionary authority he had once trusted her to exercise. The distinction mattered. This was no longer punishment delivered in emotion. It was a calculated decision by a monarch who had concluded that preserving his marriage and preserving confidence in his household were suddenly pulling him in opposite directions. Charles knew the permissions involved were ultimately his to grant or remove. The king controlled the personal household privileges at the center of this fictional crisis, including selected planning access, internal staffing influence, archive consultation, and participation in ceremonial arrangements. Discretionary authority, meaning power exercised because the monarch personally permits it, rather than because it permanently belongs to a title, could be withdrawn the same way it had been given. That made the decision legally simple inside the household and emotionally devastating inside the marriage. William remained deliberately on the edge of the process. The prince advised his father on continuity and safeguards, but Charles refused to let him become the face of the decision. The monarch insisted that every final instruction carry his own signature. He knew that if William appeared to be driving the removal, Camilla could interpret the crisis as a generational attack instead of a loss of trust between husband and wife. Charles read the order twice before signing it. The king paused over Camilla's name, removed his glasses, and sat motionless. For years, he had fought to protect the woman now named, throughout a document stripping away influence he had once defended. Then he signed. William entered afterward, and immediately told his father he had never wanted the marriage destroyed. The future king understood that institutional clarity could come at a brutal personal cost. Charles answered quietly that the issue had stopped being about saving a marriage the moment he became uncertain whether decisions inside his own household were being made with his genuine approval. The order was extensive. Camilla lost access to selected private planning channels, discretionary staffing influence, sensitive archive consultation, and authority over several internal ceremonial arrangements. The queen consort would retain her public identity, but the informal mechanisms that had given her influence behind closed doors were being sharply reduced. Charles went further still. The king ordered an independent review of every decision connected to the disputed authorization period. An independent review, in this dramatized narrative, meant a separate examination designed to trace who approved each action without relying on the people directly involved. That decision carried a darker implication. The evidence already discovered might not be the whole story. Camilla learned how quickly the changes were taking effect when an aide delivered an updated schedule. She read it once, then again. Her name had already disappeared from an engagement she had expected to lead. The signature was private, but its consequences could not remain behind palace doors for long. The harshest punishment was not delivered through shouting. It arrived on a sheet of ordinary scheduling paper. Camilla looked down at an event she had expected to attend beside Charles, and discovered that her name was gone. No dramatic explanation accompanied the change. The absence itself said enough. Hours earlier, she had still believed some part of her former position might survive. Now the machinery around the crown was already moving, as though that authority had ended. Camilla stared at the revised schedule and asked the aide whether an error had been made. The queen consort knew some ceremonial appearances could still continue because Charles had not erased her marital status or public identity. What had changed were her internal permissions and delegated influence, meaning the authority she exercised only because the king had previously trusted her to handle certain decisions. That distinction made the punishment more complicated. She was still inside the monarchy, but part of the power she had once used within it was disappearing. The aide answered quietly that the omission reflected new instructions from Charles. Camilla folded the page once. Then she told everyone to leave. She did not argue with the staff, because she understood immediately that the decision had already moved beyond discussion. Approvals that once came to her were being redirected. Household questions were moving elsewhere. The institution had started adapting before she had emotionally accepted what was happening. Charles heard later that she had cancelled a private dinner. The king almost went to her, then stopped himself. He feared that arriving immediately as a husband might weaken the boundary he had just created as monarch. That hesitation revealed the cruelty of his position. He had spent years protecting their partnership, yet now even an act of comfort risked being interpreted as retreat. William received the next development through a sealed inventory prepared for the ongoing review. The prince opened it, expecting administrative details, and instead found an entry linked to an earlier disagreement involving his father's private correspondence. A sealed inventory, in this fictional narrative, meant a restricted list of records requiring examination because their handling or authorization had been questioned. The discovery unsettled him, because it suggested the pattern might stretch beyond scheduling and ceremonial access. Camilla, meanwhile, stopped asking for privileges back. She wrote Charles a short handwritten request, asking for one final private conversation. No advisors, no lawyers, no household officials. The queen did not ask him to reverse the order. She asked only that he hear why she had acted before he decided what those actions meant about her. Charles read the note twice. Then he agreed. For the first time since the crisis began, the next confrontation would not depend on competing documents, disputed dates, or institutional procedure. It would depend entirely on whether two people who had survived decades together could still recognize the truth in each other's words. After signatures, evidence, and royal procedure came something far more difficult: the truth one spouse was willing to tell the other when nobody else could hear it. For once, there was no evidence file on the table. Charles arrived alone. Camilla was already waiting. Neither had an aide nearby, and neither could hide behind the language of procedure anymore. What followed did not restore what had been lost, but it changed the meaning of the crisis. She finally admitted what fear had driven her decisions. He finally admitted why betrayal from her had frightened him more than criticism from anyone outside the palace. Camilla spoke first. The queen consort admitted that years of conditional acceptance had left her terrified of becoming powerless inside the very system she had fought so hard to survive. She believed that holding tighter control over household influence would protect the stability she had spent decades building. Charles listened, but the king separated motive from justification. He told her that fear could explain why she acted, but it could not authorize decisions made through his name without his knowledge. Camilla admitted she had expected him to defend her because he always had. She reminded Charles that when pressure came from outside the palace, he had stood beside her repeatedly. The monarch answered that defending her from hostility was different from defending conduct he could not justify. His voice remained controlled, but the distinction carried enormous weight. For the first time, the support she had once considered absolute now had a boundary. Charles reached for her hand briefly. The gesture lasted only a moment before he withdrew it. Affection had survived. Institutional trust had not. The king told Camilla that this was precisely why the situation hurt so deeply. Criticism from strangers could be endured. Doubt inside a marriage built on decades of loyalty was different because it threatened the one place he had believed required no defense. Camilla then made the admission that deepened the wound again. In her private account to Charles, she confirmed that she knew some records had been restricted after William started asking questions. She insisted the intention had been to prevent a growing dispute from becoming a full family war. The queen believed limiting access temporarily would create time for tensions to settle. The king heard something else. The information had been controlled precisely when scrutiny was increasing. Charles did not reverse the decision. The monarch told her the independent review would continue and that the withdrawn household rights would remain withdrawn. But he also drew another line. He would not turn their private rupture into public humiliation. No theatrical stripping of dignity. No deliberate spectacle. Whatever consequences followed would be handled through structure, not revenge. Camilla understood that this was not forgiveness. It was restraint. Their marriage had not returned to what it was, but the question between them had become clearer. Affection remained. Trust would have to be rebuilt, if it could be rebuilt at all. Inside the palace, anger had finally given way to painful clarity. Outside its gates, the story was exploding into something neither of them could control. By morning, a crisis known to only a handful of people had become impossible to contain. Broadcasters abandoned ordinary royal coverage. Commentators argued over whether Charles had protected the monarchy or exposed its deepest family fracture. Yet one moment captured the public mood better than any studio debate. Outside Buckingham Palace, people stood beneath newspaper boards, carrying the same extraordinary message: the king had withdrawn Camilla's remaining internal authority, and the decision had come from Charles himself. Charles watched the morning coverage without speaking. The king heard one commentator describe the decision as the defining rupture of his marriage, and reached for the remote almost immediately. He switched off the television before the discussion could continue. What the public saw as a dramatic act of accountability was, to him, also the collapse of a partnership he had defended for decades. That contrast mattered, because the monarchy could absorb an administrative restructuring far more easily than a marriage could absorb a loss of trust. Camilla received a summary of the headlines from an aide, but refused to read the full coverage. The queen consort said she already understood what she had lost, and did not need strangers explaining it back to her. Her internal authority, meaning the delegated influence she had exercised over selected household decisions and planning channels, had been withdrawn. She still remained part of the royal family, but the private machinery around her had changed dramatically. William avoided anything that might look like triumph. The prince's household issued no celebratory response and made no attempt to claim vindication. He understood that the crisis was not a victory over Camilla. It was institutional damage that had forced Charles into a decision no family member could celebrate. The future king had wanted clarity, but clarity had arrived through pain. The public debate divided sharply. Some argued that Charles had finally demonstrated that accountability applied even inside his marriage. Others saw the spectacle as devastating proof that the relationship he had spent years protecting could no longer survive untouched by the pressures of the crown. A fictional newspaper intensified the frenzy with the front-page headline, "The King Draws the Line." The phrase spread rapidly because it reduced a complicated rupture to one unforgettable idea. Behind palace barriers, a small crowd gathered, while broadcasters repeated the most important detail. Charles himself had signed the order. That fact destroyed the easiest theory. William had not secretly engineered his stepmother's fall. The responsibility rested with the king. Charles knew that revelation changed the entire story. The question was no longer who had defeated Camilla. It was what his decision had permanently altered between husband and wife, father and heir, and monarch and institution. The world had chosen its headlines. Charles still had to decide what remained when the noise faded. In the end, there was no dramatic restoration, and no last-minute reversal. Charles allowed the order to stand. Camilla accepted that the authority she once exercised would not return. William refused to treat the outcome as victory. What remained was something quieter and more consequential. Three people forced to understand that affection, loyalty, and royal responsibility could exist together only when trust survived between them. In this crisis, trust had broken, and the crown had demanded a price. Charles received the final findings of the review and did not change his decision. Within this fictional narrative, the examination concluded that the disputed actions were serious enough to justify permanently withdrawing the delegated privileges at the center of the crisis. Delegated privileges, meaning authority personally granted by the monarch rather than permanently attached to royal title, could therefore remain removed without altering Camilla's marital position. The distinction mattered. She remained his wife, but she would no longer exercise the same internal influence. William accepted greater visibility over decisions connected to long-term continuity, but the prince did not replace his father as final authority. Charles retained control while introducing clearer approval structures designed to prevent private influence from becoming confused with official permission. The future king understood that this responsibility was not a prize. It was an obligation, created by a breakdown nobody inside the family had wanted. Camilla stopped fighting the new reality. The queen consort recognized that demanding restoration would only deepen the damage between herself and Charles. She accepted a narrower ceremonial and personal role, even though the loss remained painful. What collapsed was not her marriage or her place beside the king. It was the assumption that decades of devotion could protect every form of institutional trust once that trust had been crossed. Charles later spoke privately with William about the cost. The king told his son that protecting the crown should never feel like defeating someone in the family. The prince answered that the hardest duty was often preventing private loyalty from becoming public weakness. Neither man celebrated. Both understood that a monarchy built only on affection would eventually become vulnerable to the very people closest to it. Charles finally accepted the emotional truth beneath everything that had happened. He had not chosen William over Camilla as a person. He had chosen a standard of accountability he believed had to apply even to the woman nearest to him. That was why the decision hurt so deeply. Camilla's collapse became symbolic of that realization. She understood, in one devastating moment, that personal devotion and institutional confidence were not the same thing. The crown survived. The marriage survived. But the old balance of power did not. William carried greater responsibility. Camilla accepted new limits. Charles carried the cost of drawing the line himself. Nothing returned to exactly what it had been before. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.